At age 54, Kurt Warner wakes up on a quiet morning, carrying on his shoulders an entire career that NFL history has recorded with numbers that command respect from anyone. Two-time league MVP, the leader who took the street. Louis Rams to victory in Super Bowl XXXIV. The one who ignited the greatest show on turf with an offensive style that changed an era of American football, and the very person who led the Arizona Cardinals, a team once seen as the symbol of failure, straight to Super Bowl XIII, with one of the greatest individual playoff performances in history. He threw for more than 32,000 yards, scored 208 touchdowns, made the Pro Bowl 4 times, won the NFC Championship twice, was named Super Bowl MVP, and finally stepped into the Pro Football Hall of Fame as proof that his story was no longer a fleeting stroke of luck, but an official legacy of this brutal sport. On the surface, it was the perfect American dream. From a grocery store stock boy to NFL legend, from a guy cut by the Packers to an icon cheered by stadiums. But as that morning passed, in silence, no field, no roaring crowd, Kurt Warner understood better than anyone that those titles never told the full story of his life. Because every trophy came at the cost of constant fear that the miracle could end at any moment, every successful season carried the pressure that one injury, one bad decision, one replacement could drag him right back to the starting line. He lived for years not in the confidence of a winner, but in the mindset of someone always bracing for the next time he'd be let go, because the past had taught him that no one owes you a second chance. Off the field, the hurts that don't show up in the stat sheet. Heavy family responsibilities, long nights worrying about the future, a body full of collision scars, and the willpower to force himself to get back up, even when no one was watching. Kurt Warner didn't fight to be celebrated. He fought not to collapse, to protect what he loved, to prove to himself that a person's worth isn't just in the moments when the applause comes. And right in the emptiness of that very ordinary morning, when all the miracles had been used up, and the spotlight was only a memory, the cruelest question emerged, not for history or the fans, but for him alone. If your whole life has been a fight just to survive, if every step forward has to be paid for with fear and silent erosion, can that really be called a victory? If you want to keep following the journey behind the spotlight, where miracles aren't easy anymore and every step comes at a cost, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next part of this story. After that quiet morning, with the question about victory still hanging in the air, Kurt Warner's memories naturally drifted back to where it all began. Not a football field, not stadium lights, but a very ordinary house in Iowa, where his childhood passed in prolonged silence. Kurt's parents divorced when he was very young. There were no fierce arguments, no shouting or violence leaving obvious scars, but that quiet separation created a cold void that any child could feel. The house still stood, meals still happened on time, everything on the outside looked fine, but inside, the sense of security, the one thing a child needs most, had vanished very early. Kurt grew up in a space where no one hurt him with fists, but no one hugged him and said everything would be okay, that his future was secure, that no matter what happened, someone would be standing there waiting. For many other kids, family is a shelter, a backstop when the outside world gets too big and too scary. But for Kurt, family early on became a fragile structure, where everything could change without warning. His parents no longer lived together, each busy with their own lives, and in the gap between those two adults, Kurt learned to handle his emotions on his own. He doesn't remember memories of being yelled at or starved. What he remembers more clearly is the feeling of not knowing who he could rely on when he needed to, not knowing if tomorrow would be different from today. That absence wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but it clung to a child's mind, quietly forming a deep-seated fear, the fear of being left behind. At school, Kurt wasn't a standout kid. He wasn't a genius, wasn't an early star who drew attention. He was just a boy trying to fit in, trying to do the right thing, but always carrying the sense that he could be pushed to the sidelines at any moment. While other kids believed their family would stand behind them even in failure, Kurt learned early that nothing was certain. Failure wasn't just bad grades or a lost game. It was the risk of losing the fragile place he held. That feeling made him cautious, always mentally preparing for the worst, even in the moments that should have been the most carefree of childhood. The house wasn't cold because it lacked people. It was cold because it lacked assurance. Kurt wasn't given firm promises about the future, wasn't guided by long-term plans or pre-drawn dreams. He grew up with the idea that he had to take care of himself, that no one was obligated to stay if things got hard. For a child, that was too heavy a burden, but Kurt carried it as a natural part of life. He learned not to expect too much, because expecting meant disappointment, and disappointment was something he had tasted very early. That emotional insecurity shaped Kurt Warner long before football entered his life. It kept him from ever feeling completely at ease, even when things seemed to be going right. It taught him that every relationship, every opportunity, every dream could vanish, and so he had to always be ready for the day they disappeared. The fear of being left behind didn't make Kurt weak in an obvious way. Instead, it made him quietly resilient, always trying harder than necessary so he wouldn't become expendable in any situation. Looking back, Kurt understands that his childhood wasn't materially deprived, but it lacked the most important thing, the feeling of being held tight. And because he wasn't embraced enough, he grew up with the need to prove he deserved to stay, deserved to be trusted, deserved a place that couldn't easily be taken away. The tragedy of Kurt Warner's childhood wasn't in obvious wounds, but in the prolonged silence, in the feeling that if he didn't walk forward himself, no one would take his hand and lead him through the dark. That insecurity didn't disappear when he grew up. It only changed form, following him into every decision, every battle, every moment he had to stand up after failure, and becoming the deep root of the fear that would haunt him his entire life. After years of growing up with no sense of assurance, Kurt Warner entered adulthood with a fragile belief that football might be the only path to finding a clear place in this world. Northern Iowa wasn't a name that made NFL scouts pause twice, and Kurt knew that from the start. He wasn't pampered by glory, wasn't labeled a generational talent, had no promises of a certain future. But because of that, he threw himself into training with near-desperate intensity, believing that if he tried hard enough, if he did everything right, at least someone would notice. The NFL draft came and went without fanfare, no call, no handshake, no ticket to the dream he had chased for years. Kurt wasn't just undrafted. He was almost non-existent on any team's priority list. The Green Bay Packers eventually signed him, and in that brief moment, Kurt allowed himself to hope. Stepping into an NFL team, even in the lowest role, was enough for him to believe his prior efforts hadn't been completely meaningless. He trained quietly, memorized every playbook, tried not to make mistakes, tried not to draw negative attention because he knew he had no margin for error. But the NFL isn't a place for patient stories. After a short time, the Packers cut Kurt Warner without hesitation. No long talk, no clear explanation, no suggestion of what he needed to improve to come back. Just a clean, cold decision, as if he had never belonged there. The moment he was cut wasn't just a career shock. It struck straight at the deepest fear that had followed Kurt since childhood. Once again, he was discarded without a chance to prove he deserved to stay. Once again, no one stepped up to say he was good enough, that he needed more time, that this failure didn't define him. Kurt left Green Bay with a heavier question than any injury. If everything he had done still wasn't enough, then where was the line between effort and futility? For the first time in his life, Kurt had to confront a brutal truth he had only vaguely sensed before. Effort doesn't guarantee recognition. The professional world doesn't run on emotional fairness, doesn't reward persistence just because it's admirable. In the NFL, you're either good enough at the right moment or you disappear, and no one owes you an explanation. For someone who grew up with emotional insecurity, that wasn't just failure. It was confirmation of the fear of being left behind that always lurked. After being cut, Kurt didn't walk out of the locker room as an angry or bitter man. He walked out empty. The NFL dream, once seen as an escape, suddenly slammed shut in his face, revealing nothing but vast, directionless emptiness behind it. No other team called right away, no second chance waiting. Kurt returned to the familiar feeling from childhood. If he didn't stand up himself, no one would do it for him. In the days that followed, he wondered if he had misunderstood himself all along. Were all those years of training, early mornings, exhausting nights, just the stubbornness of someone who didn't know when to quit? Being cut by the Packers didn't just take his job. It took the fragile belief that doing things right would make life respond. Kurt began to understand that the road ahead wouldn't be paved, that if he wanted to continue, he would have to accept a lower, smaller position, even invisible to most of the world. Right in this period, Kurt's NFL dream didn't shatter in one explosive moment, but was worn down day by the silence. No one said he had failed forever, but no one said he still had a chance either. That ambiguity was the most painful part, because it forced him to decide for himself whether he still had the strength to chase a dream that had already rejected him. And in that quietness, Kurt Warner began to learn the first lesson, the one that would follow him for the rest of his life. Sometimes, the hardest thing isn't losing, it's continuing to believe in your own worth when the world has turned its back, without leaving any explanation behind. After the NFL door closed, without a single explanation, Kurt Warner walked out of the dream with empty hands and an unanswered question about his own value. No more locker room, no more practice field, no more strategy meetings where he could cling to the feeling that he still belonged somewhere. Instead, there was a job he never imagined would be tied to his name: stocking shelves at a local grocery store. Every day, Kurt put on a simple uniform, stood under the cold fluorescent lights among the aisles, arranged each box of products in silence, trying to do his best at a task that had nothing to do with the dream he had chased through his youth. No one there knew that the man bowing his head in front of them had once dreamed of standing under NFL stadium lights, and Kurt didn't dare tell them. The grocery store job didn't humiliate him because it was physically hard. It humiliated him because it exposed the gap between the person he once believed he would become and the person he now was. Every shift was a test of self-respect. Kurt watched customers push carts full of groceries past him, listened to their ordinary conversations about dinner, about vacations, about seemingly trivial things, while his mind constantly calculated whether that meager paycheck would be enough to get through the next week. He counted every dollar, weighed every expense, not because he had never known hardship before, but because now failure had made everything more fragile than ever. The NFL dream had once been his ticket out of the childhood insecurity, and when it vanished, Kurt stood again before the same old fear. No one was guaranteeing his future. The most painful thing wasn't the job itself, but the silence surrounding it. Kurt avoided old acquaintances, avoided casual questions like, "So, what are you up to these days?" He didn't want to explain that he had come so close to the dream, only to be discarded like a mistake. He didn't want to see pity or sympathy in anyone's eyes. Instead, he chose to shrink himself, to accept an invisible life where no one expected anything from him, but no one would be disappointed anymore either. For Kurt, this wasn't poverty in the material sense. It was a poverty of belief, where he began to doubt his own worth. The long nights after shifts were the heaviest times. When the store closed and the lights dimmed, Kurt went home with an exhausted body but a restless mind. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, letting the thoughts swirl. Had he tried hard enough? Was he clinging to a dream that was never meant for him? Was continuing to believe in football just the stubbornness of someone refusing to accept reality? There was no one standing beside him to reassure him that this path would lead to something better. Kurt had only himself, facing the truth that adult life doesn't reward effort fairly. In his weakest moments, he considered giving up football entirely, finding a steadier job, living an ordinary life without the painful expectations. But every time that thought arose, it brought a deeper sadness, the feeling that if he quit, he would confirm every doubt that had ever surrounded him, that the people who cut him had been right, that the NFL dream was just an illusion of a boy who grew up without emotional security. That very tension turned the grocery store years into a form of silent mental torture, where Kurt had to keep choosing between protecting himself from disappointment and continuing to believe in the thing that had hurt him. No one in the store knew that every box Kurt placed on the shelf was stacked by someone who had once thrown a football at the highest level he could reach. No one knew that behind that quiet figure was a man carrying shame for his failure, for not yet becoming the version he had once promised himself. Kurt wasn't openly despised, but that normalization of his failure hurt more than any mockery ever could. It forced him to live with the feeling that he had slipped off the track of life without anyone noticing, that his disappearance hadn't left any significant void. And right in that silence, Kurt Warner gradually understood the true nature of the pain he was enduring. It wasn't the pain of having no money or no fame. It was the pain of not daring to say out loud what he had once dreamed of. When a person has to hide his dream because he's afraid it will become a joke, that's when failure reaches the depths of self-respect. But from that very bottom, a different kind of resolve quietly took shape. Kurt didn't know if he still had any chance left, but he knew one thing. If he gave up in this silence, the shame would follow him for the rest of his life. The years stocking shelves didn't make Kurt Warner strong in a glamorous way, but they forged in him a bitter resilience, where every passing day was a challenge to keep believing he wasn't just the sum of what he'd lost, but also of what he hadn't yet become. After those months living among the shelves in silent humiliation, Kurt Warner stepped into the Arena League not as a triumphant return, but as someone trying to hold on to the last thin thread connecting him to the dream. The Arena League wasn't the NFL. Smaller fields, dimmer lights, sidelines so narrow you could hear each other's heavy breathing. The crowds weren't big. The cheers weren't loud enough to drown out the feeling that this was just a miniature world, a scaled-down version of what he once believed was his destiny. Kurt stepped onto the field in a simple uniform, no fireworks, no elaborate ceremonies, and in that moment, he realized he was standing very far from where he had dreamed of, even though he still held the football in his hands. The Arena League gave Kurt the chance to play, but it also forced him to face the truth that his dream had been shrunk. The throws still needed precision. The decisions still had to be quick. But the scale of everything was different. No big cameras followed every movement. No media waited to analyze every play. Failure here didn't make headlines, but success didn't open any grand doors either. Kurt played in front of sparse stands, hearing the clear sound of cleats scraping the turf, and in that closeness, he felt both relief and pain. Relief because he was finally playing again, pain because he understood he was having to accept a smaller version of the dream that had once consumed his entire youth. Every Arena League game was a silent negotiation with himself. Kurt wondered whether he was moving forward or just delaying the inevitable. He knew full well that very few paths from the Arena League led straight back to the NFL, that for many, this was the final stop, not a midway station, but he still took the field with the seriousness of someone not ready to let go. Not because he was certain he'd get called back, but because if he didn't give everything here, there would be nowhere left to prove he still deserved a place. The small field made every mistake feel magnified. There was no space to hide, no big crowd to blend into. Kurt had to confront head-on every errant throw, every slow read, every flicker of doubt in his mind. But right in that confined space, he also learned to focus on the most basic things, not fame, not a distant future, but the play right in front of him, the next breath, the next small decision. The dream was no longer a glorious vision at the end of the road. It became a series of concrete actions that needed to be done well in the present. Kurt understood that he was drifting further from what he once believed was his destiny, but that distance didn't plunge him into despair the way he once thought it would. Instead, it forced him to re-examine the meaning of chasing a dream. Was a dream only valuable when it was grand and recognized, or did it still matter when it was scaled down, when it was only the effort to keep himself from feeling useless? The Arena League didn't grant him glory, but it granted him something else, the right to keep believing he wasn't finished yet. On the evenings after games, Kurt sat alone in the quiet locker room, listening to the echo of his own thoughts. He knew that with every day spent here, the NFL door might close a little more. But he also knew that if he quit now, the dream wouldn't just shrink, it would disappear completely. The choice was no longer between winning and losing, but between continuing and vanishing. And Kurt, the man who had once been cut without explanation, understood that the most painful thing wasn't failure. It was disappearing without having tried his absolute hardest. The Arena League taught Kurt a bitter but necessary lesson. Dreams don't always break with a loud crash. Sometimes they just contract bit by bit, forcing the pursuer to adjust expectations, to learn to live with humility and doubt. Kurt stepped onto the field each time, aware that he was playing in a world few people cared about, but he still played as if every snap could be his last chance. No one promised this effort would be rewarded, but he no longer waited for any promises either. As the season passed, Kurt Warner no longer had illusions that the Arena League would bring him back to the place he once dreamed of, but he also didn't see it as a complete step backward. It was a shrunken space where he could reforge himself, sharpen a will that had been eroded by failure and shame. His NFL dream didn't shatter here. It contracted, became smaller, less glamorous, but it still existed. And in that contraction, Kurt learned to carry the dream forward without needing it to look like what he had once imagined. After those scaled-down seasons in the Arena League, when the NFL dream had shrunk to just enough to keep him from collapsing, Kurt Warner stepped into the biggest event of his life. Not on a football field, but in his private life where there were no spectators, no referees, and no rules to protect him from ruthless choices. Brenda entered Kurt's life like a paradox. She didn't bring stability, didn't bring a bright future, and certainly didn't bring any promise that everything would be okay. Brenda brought a past full of violence, unhealed emotional wounds, and 2 young children, including Zachary, a boy who suffered severe brain damage after an accident when he was very young. For many men at the bottom of their careers, that was something they would avoid at all costs. For Kurt, it was the moment life forced him to look straight at himself. Brenda didn't hide her past. She talked about the years lived in fear, about the nights she had to protect her children from violence, about the exhaustion of a single mother who didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Kurt listened in silence, not because he had answers, but because he understood that feeling better than anyone. The feeling of having no one there when you need them. The feeling of having to carry your own life with no guarantees. But if Brenda was a woman carrying emotional cracks, then Zachary was a challenge far beyond anything Kurt had ever imagined. The boy needed lifelong care, not a few years, not a tough phase, but his entire life. Long therapy sessions, unscheduled doctor's visits, sleepless nights from worry, and a future no one could map out with neat, comforting lines. At that point, Kurt had nothing in hand to promise. He had no NFL contract, no steady income, no social standing to shield anyone. He had just stepped out of the grocery store, just gone through the Arena League, and was still living with the anxiety that tomorrow he could lose everything again. And right in that situation, life posed a question with no easy escape: walk away to save himself, or stay and shoulder a responsibility that might crush the rest of his life. This wasn't a choice between right and wrong, but between relief and honesty, between running from the burden and accepting a fate heavier than he could bear. Kurt understood very clearly that if he left, no one had the right to blame him. Society often forgives a man struggling with his career when he chooses to protect himself first. But Kurt also understood that if he walked away, he would confirm his deepest fear, that when things get hard, people can disappear. He had grown up with that feeling, had lived for years under the shadow of the fear of being left behind, and now he stood on the verge of becoming the very thing he had once feared. There was no promise that this love would be rewarded, no guarantee he would be strong enough to carry it, and certainly no romantic vision of a perfect ending. The decision to stay didn't come as a heroic moment. It came in silence, in long nights of weighing everything, in the fear that he was pushing himself down a road with no way back. When Kurt chose Brenda and Zachary, he didn't choose love in the usual sense. He chose a lifelong responsibility. He chose to accept that his life would no longer revolve around himself, that every decision from then on would have to put the needs of a child who could never take care of himself ahead of his personal dream. For Kurt, that wasn't a sacrifice to be celebrated. It was a moral duty he wouldn't allow himself to dodge. The years that followed were anything but easy. Caring for Zachary didn't bring a sense of being saved. It brought constant exhaustion, limits that Kurt couldn't overcome with willpower or training. There were days he felt like he was fighting in a war with no finish line, where progress wasn't measured by achievements, but by keeping things from getting worse. While peers his age chased careers and built their own lives, Kurt had to learn to live with the dependence of a child who needed him every hour, every minute. It was a form of imprisonment without bars, where love itself was what locked the door to leaving. Brenda saw that and carried her own guilt. She knew Kurt's life would have been very different without her and Zachary, but Kurt didn't allow himself to harbor resentment. He understood that real love isn't something that arrives only when all conditions are favorable. It's something that exists even when no conditions support it. And right in the hardest moments, when the NFL dream had almost vanished, Kurt realized this choice had changed him more deeply than any career failure ever could. It forced him to grow up in a painful way, where a person's worth no longer tied to what he achieved, but to what he was willing to endure. No miracle happened right after that decision. No sudden contract, no light at the end of the tunnel switched on as a reward for being right. Kurt kept living in uncertainty, kept playing in lesser-known leagues, kept carrying the responsibility he had voluntarily taken on. But from that moment, he no longer fought just for himself. Every time he stepped on the field, every time he got up after failure, he carried the image of Zachary, the child who would never understand why adults had to make such choices, but would live his whole life with the consequences of that choice. The Brenda and Zachary chapter wasn't a beautiful one to make audiences tear up and move on. It was a heavy chapter, with no hero and no villain, just a man forced to decide who he would become when there were no easy paths left. Kurt Warner wasn't given a neat escape in this story. He wasn't promised everything would be okay. He was only given a choice, and he chose to carry. Right from that moment, Kurt's life stopped being a journey in search of glory and became a journey to keep the people he loved from being left behind, even if that meant carrying a burden no title could ever lighten. After the decision to take on Brenda and Zachary, when Kurt Warner's life had been locked into an endless responsibility, the miracle that America, later called by beautiful words, arrived in an almost cruel way. Kurt Warner walked into the street, Louis Ram's training camp, not as someone expected, but as a temporary backup plan, a name with a question mark. He didn't arrive there with the mindset of someone about to make history, but with a very ordinary worry. If he failed this time, what would he use to support his family? What would he use to face a child who needed him for life? Kurt was used to being underestimated, but this time, the weight on his back was heavier than all the years before combined. When the opportunity came, an opportunity born from someone else's injury, it came so fast that Kurt couldn't believe it was real. In a short time, he went from a forgotten name to the center of a fiery offensive machine. Precise throws, a rhythm that swept through every defense, and the Rams suddenly became a phenomenon. MVP, Super Bowl. The titles Kurt once thought would never be his appeared one after another like a series of unreal images. America called it a fairy tale, called Kurt Warner a living proof of the American dream, proof that if you never give up, the impossible can happen. But amid that storm of praise, Kurt felt a deeper anxiety than ever before. He had no time to enjoy it. Every win didn't bring security. It only made the fear of losing everything grow. Kurt understood better than anyone that he hadn't risen from a prepared path. He wasn't a long-term investment product, not a face protected by fat contracts or an organization's patience. He was a replacement, given a chance in an unusual situation, and that very fact made everything fragile. The miracle came so fast that Kurt didn't have time to build a mental foundation for it. One mistake, one injury, one bad season, all could end the fairy tale instantly. While the media talked about the MVP title, Kurt thought about bills, about Zachary's therapy schedule, about the future of a family that still wasn't solid. His family stood in front of the spotlight, but inside, they still trembled. Brenda understood that Kurt's career was at its peak, but she also understood clearly that a peak that came too fast rarely brought stability. Constant travel, performance pressure, public scrutiny made their private life more fragile than ever. Kurt stepped onto the field each week, not just with a quarterback's responsibility, but with the worry that if he fell, the small world he had chosen to carry would collapse with him. The Super Bowl brought the trophy Kurt had dreamed of his whole life, but the moment of raising that trophy didn't erase the deep fear etched in his heart. Amid the wild cheers, Kurt felt like he was standing on thin ground. Everything was so beautiful, it felt suspicious. He didn't allow himself to fully believe in the joy, because believing meant being vulnerable. For Kurt, joy had never been a pure emotion. It always came with the worry that the price would come later. MVP, Super Bowl, endless praise, all of it made America enchanted. But it kept Kurt in a state of constant tension. He couldn't enjoy the carefree feeling of a winner, because he knew he was living in a miracle with no long-term commitment. Nights after games, when the stadium lights went out, Kurt returned to the same old obsession. Would everything still be there tomorrow? Would he still be needed? Or would he be replaced again? Pushed aside like before? The family remained fragile, even though fame had knocked. The responsibility for Zachary didn't lessen just because Kurt had won the Super Bowl. On the contrary, it grew heavier, because now Kurt had to keep his family steady amid the storm of attention and expectations. He didn't dare let himself slip, didn't dare allow himself weakness, because one mistake from him now wasn't just personal failure. It could bring irreversible consequences for the people he loved. The Rams' miracle lifted Kurt Warner to a peak he once thought unreachable, but it also exposed a harsh truth. Hope that comes too fast isn't always a blessing. When everything happens at breakneck speed, people don't have time to adapt, don't have time to believe, don't have time to build a sense of security. Kurt stood in the brightest spotlight of his life, with a fear greater than the joy, the fear that everything he had was only temporary, that the miracle would eventually leave, leaving him once again facing the familiar emptiness. And right in that moment, between the MVP and the Super Bowl, Kurt Warner didn't feel like he had won at life. He only felt like he was racing against time, trying to hold on to everything before the miracle that all of America adored vanished as quickly as it had arrived. The ram's miracle hadn't even had time to settle before it turned into a sword hanging over Kurt Warner's head. From the moment he was celebrated as the symbol of the American dream, Kurt entered a phase harsher than any of his previous years of hardship, because now failure was no longer the private matter of an unknown person. It was the public collapse of a story that the entire country had placed its faith in. The pressure to repeat the miracle weighed heavily on every practice, every strategy meeting, every throw. No one was asking anymore if Kurt deserved it. The only question was whether he could do it again, and if not, how the fairy tale would end. When the next season began, all eyes were on Kurt, with expectations that were almost unreasonable. People weren't waiting for a good quarterback. They were waiting for the miracle to repeat itself. Every win was taken as a given. Every smallest mistake magnified into a sign of the impending collapse. Kurt stepped onto the field, feeling like he wasn't allowed to play like a human being, but had to play like a pre-framed legend. The miracle wasn't allowed to fail, because if it failed, the faith of millions would shatter along with it. The throwing arm injury arrived like a cruel reminder that the human body doesn't care about any fairy tale. The initial nagging pain quickly became a constant obsession. Kurt could clearly feel every release wasn't the same as before. Every throw carried caution, and that very caution made him more afraid. For a quarterback, the throwing arm isn't just a tool, it's identity. And when identity starts to betray, everything collapses from the inside. Kurt tried to hide it, tried to play through the pain, because he understood that, in this world, injury doesn't wait for anyone. If he showed weakness, if he needed time, someone else would be ready to step in and replace him. The media, which had once lifted Kurt to the skies, began to change its tone. The articles praising the American fairy tale gradually gave way to cold analyses of decline, of the possibility that the miracle was only temporary. The story shifted from hero to one-season wonder so fast that Kurt barely had time to notice. The questions in interviews grew sharper, less patient. Every inaccurate throw was dissected as proof that the legend had expired. Kurt was no longer allowed to make mistakes like a normal player. He had to prove he still deserved the title he had never dared to claim for himself. That pressure didn't stop on the field. It seeped into the already fragile family life. Brenda could clearly sense the tension in every step Kurt took when he came home. Zachary still needed consistent care, schedules that couldn't be delayed, worries that couldn't be set aside just because of injury or performance slumps. Kurt had to play two roles at once: a quarterback expected to sustain the miracle, and a father who wasn't allowed to collapse. Every time his arm throbbed with pain, the fear wasn't just about losing his spot. It was about losing the ability to protect his family from another free fall. On the field, Kurt began playing with more fear than belief. He knew he was being scrutinized every step of the way, and that very scrutiny made him rigid. The miracle had once come from freedom in play, from the belief that there was nothing left to lose. Now, with everything built into legend, Kurt had far too much to lose. Every game became a survival test, where he not only had to beat the opposing defense, but also fight his own body, and the obsession that one more mistake would end it all. As injuries caused his performance to drop, the world's patience ran thin. The miracle was no longer seen as a fragile wonder, but as a promise that had to be fulfilled. Kurt felt trapped between two opposing images: the real human, with very clear limits, and the legendary image the public wouldn't allow to crack. The gap between those two images grew wider every day, and Kurt stood right in the middle, stretched to the point of pain. The media turned its back not with hatred, but with coldness. The headlines weren't sensational anymore, but they cut like knives. Is he still himself? Has the miracle run out? Those questions didn't need answers. They existed to plant doubt. Kurt read them, heard them, and tried not to let them touch him. But no one is completely immune. Every doubt was like a small cut, not enough to kill, but enough to bleed him slowly. In this period, Kurt understood the cruel downside of the peak. When you're up there, there's no room for weakness, no space for slow recovery. The miracle lifted you up, and now that same miracle becomes the only standard by which you're judged. Kurt wasn't allowed to be human. He had to be the story. And when the story risked breaking, people were ready to step back and look for a new miracle. The peak, which Kurt once thought was finally safe, now became a knife at his throat. Every passing day was another day he had to prove he wasn't expired, that the miracle still held. No one said outright that he would be replaced, but no one needed to. Kurt had once been on the other side of that silence, and he recognized it instantly. The miracle wasn't allowed to fail, because if it failed, Kurt Warner's story would no longer be the American dream. It would just be a bitter reminder that even the most miraculous things can be discarded when they no longer meet expectations. When the knife of the peak was pressed right against his throat, the inevitable moment finally arrived, cold and swift, just like the way this world often ends the stories it once loved. Kurt Warner was cut from the street. Louis Rams, not in a tribute ceremony, not with thanks for the man who brought home the MVP and Super Bowl, but with a dry administrative decision. The miracle had expired. And when the miracle expires, people don't need memories. They just need the empty spot to fill with the next name. There was no formal moment to say goodbye. No acknowledgement that Kurt himself had breathed life into a once anonymous team. Just a prolonged silence. The kind of silence Kurt understood so well, it gave him chills. He had stood on the other side of it before, when the Packers cut him without explanation, when the NFL dream was rejected like a mistake to be erased quickly. Now, history repeated itself, only this time he had once been at the top, and that made the fall hurt more. The Rams didn't need Kurt anymore. The miracle they had once worshipped had become a burden to leave behind. The feeling of being abandoned this time wasn't like the previous ones. It didn't carry the surprise. It carried inevitability. Kurt had seen it in the way the media changed its tone, in the meetings where eyes avoided his, in the way his name appeared less and less on long-term plans. But even though he had mentally prepared, the moment he was pushed out that door still left him breathless, not because of losing the job, but because of losing the position, the fragile position he had fought his whole life to hold, and never truly believed was his forever. When he left the Rams, Kurt didn't carry resentment. He carried a very familiar emptiness, as if everything he had built was only allowed to exist as long as it served a beautiful story. When that story needed to end, the storyteller moved to the next page, leaving the old character in the silence. Kurt returned to his old place in the NFL world, someone who could be erased at any moment. No long-term contract, no guarantees, no protected memories. Alongside Kurt's fall, his life story suddenly mirrored another familiar tragedy in the world of fame. When empires collapse, when the lights go out, the person is returned to zero. Like a creator who once stood at the height of power and suddenly went bankrupt, Kurt understood that a sports career operates by that same ruthless logic. There is no permanent credit, no accumulated goodwill. Every day is a tryout day. And when you no longer deliver, you're replaced. For Kurt, the scariest thing wasn't having to find a new team. It was having to face his family and tell them everything was uncertain again. Brenda had walked through the darkest years with him, and Zachary still needed stability that couldn't be postponed. Kurt didn't have the privilege of collapse. He couldn't allow himself to sink into bitterness or self-pity, but that very suppression made the pain spread deeper. When a man isn't allowed to fall, every mental cut has to be hidden, and the price paid is an ever-growing loneliness. The media quickly rewrote the story, from legend to past his prime, from miracle to expired. Those headlines didn't scream, but they were cold to the point of cruelty. Kurt read them like reading an unsigned obituary. He understood that without a new miracle, his name would gradually fade from big discussions, and eventually from collective memory. That didn't just threaten fame. It threatened the very sense of existence he had spent his life trying to build. Kurt returned to free agency with a resume sparkling in the past, but full of question marks in the present. Conversations no longer talked about potential, they talked about risk, throwing arm injury, age, inconsistent performance. Every weakness was scrutinized closely, as if every prior achievement was just a footnote. Kurt understood this clearly. In that world, memory doesn't save anyone. Only the present does. And his present was being doubted. The feeling of being erased hovered like a ghost. Kurt had lived with it when stocking shelves in the grocery store, had faced it in the Arena League, and now it returned at the highest level. The only difference was that this time he had once touched everything. And when a person has once had it all, having it taken away makes the emptiness so much larger. Kurt was no longer the anonymous young man who could endure failure by hoping for the future. He was a man with a family, with responsibilities, with people depending on his decisions. Every wrong choice now didn't just affect him, it affected the ones he loved. In the days after leaving the Rams, Kurt lived between two worlds. One world reminded him that he had once been MVP, Super Bowl champion, an icon, and another world whispered that all of it might now be a past that could never be repeated. He walked between those two voices with a deep exhaustion, trying to keep himself from tipping fully into despair. But the harsh truth was, no one owed him another miracle anymore. Being cut from the Rams wasn't just losing a team. It was the moment Kurt realized his American dream had no insurance. It could be canceled at any time, without reason, without thanks. And in that silence, Kurt Warner once again stood before the most familiar test of his life. Would he keep walking when the world was ready to close his story? The miracle had expired. But right from that emptiness, the old question returned, heavier than ever. When no one is waiting for you anymore, do you still have the courage not to disappear? Leaving St. Louis in silence, Kurt Warner stepped to the New York Giants with a fragile hope that he still had enough value not to be erased from the NFL map. The Giants didn't give him a romantic resurrection story, they gave him one final, public, brutal, unforgiving test. New York is a place where the lights never soften, where failure isn't shielded by sympathy. And Kurt understood that from the very first practices. He was no longer the awaited miracle, nor a long-term project. He was a high-risk gamble, thrown onto the field with the slim expectation that past glory might offset an unstable present. But the present didn't stand on his side. The first games unfolded like a prolonged nightmare. Kurt played badly in ways that couldn't be denied. Inaccurate throws, slow decisions, awkward moments under pressure quickly made the stands lose patience. No one was talking about MVP or Super Bowl anymore. What people saw was a quarterback who seemed to have lost his rhythm, as if body and mind were no longer in sync. Every mistake Kurt made in New York wasn't just a technical error. It was evidence for the public to confirm what they had long suspected. The Rams' miracle was truly dead. New York media showed no mercy. They didn't analyze to understand, they dissected. To conclude, articles, sports shows, radio debates, all revolved around one single question. Why did the Giants put faith in someone who was past his prime? Kurt read and listened not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't avoid it. In New York, failure doesn't let you disappear quietly. It drags you into the light and exposes every weakness to millions of eyes. Kurt felt clearly, as belief was drained bit by bit, as doubtful glances came from teammates, as the bench grew closer than ever. The most painful thing wasn't the criticism from outside, but the wordless change inside the locker room. Kurt had once been the trusted teammate, the center of the system, the one holding the team's breath. Now he felt like a burden. No one said it outright, but that silence was terrifyingly familiar. Kurt had lived with it too long not to recognize it. It was the sign that your time was almost up. With the Giants, Kurt didn't just fail professionally, he failed publicly. Every time he took the field was a time of scrutiny. Every time he left, it was a time facing the question of whether he still belonged here. For someone who had been discarded multiple times in life, the experience wasn't new, but the scale was different. This time, he wasn't an anonymous nobody forgotten. He was someone who had once stood at the peak, now being pulled down in front of all America. That contrast multiplied the pain. His family watched everything from afar, with unconcealed worry. Brenda understood that every bad game didn't just hurt Kurt's career, it eroded the willpower he had scraped together from so many years of failure. Zachary didn't fully understand what was happening, but the tension in the air couldn't be hidden. Kurt came home after games, feeling like he was bringing failure back, not just for himself, but for the people he had promised to protect. And then, the inevitable came. Kurt lost his spot. Not in an explosive moment, but in a slow slide, where belief was withdrawn little by little until nothing was left to hold on to. For the first time in his life, Kurt faced a stark reality. No one believed anymore. Not because he had never achieved anything great, but because in this world, memory has no value if the present doesn't deliver. The near total loss of standing plunged Kurt into a profound emptiness. He no longer knew what he was fighting for. The miracle had expired with the Rams. The failure with the Giants seemed like an undeniable final period. Doors that had closed in the past now slammed shut harder, because this time no one was waiting for him to get back up. Kurt was no longer an inspiring story. He was a warning. In the days that followed, Kurt lived with the feeling of drifting to the edge, pushed mercilessly by the NFL's current. He had once feared being left behind as a child, feared disappearing while stocking shelves, and now that fear returned in its clearest form. Criticized, doubted, replaced, Kurt stood before the greatest risk of his life, not ending his career in glory or bitterness, but ending it in indifference. And right at that absolute bottom, when the world's belief had completely shattered, Kurt Warner was forced to face the question with no way to avoid it. If no one believes in you anymore, do you still have enough strength to believe in yourself? After the public fall in New York, when the world's belief had dried up to the point that no one waited for another miracle, Kurt Warner stepped into Arizona as an exhausted man who still refused to disappear. The Cardinals weren't a promised land. They were a weak team, lacking identity, seen as the NFL's low spot, where hopes usually came to fade rather than ignite. No welcome banners, no talk of resurrection. Kurt arrived not as a hero, but as a temporary fix, a familiar name to fill the gap while the team looked for something better. And that very indifference gave Kurt something he hadn't had in years: quiet. In Arizona, expectations were so low they were almost non-existent. No pressure to repeat the miracle, no promises to uphold. Kurt wasn't forced to become a legend. He just had to be himself. But himself at this point was a man carrying decades of being cut, doubted, replaced. Someone who had gone through peaks and valleys to the point of having no illusions left about fairness or rewards. Kurt walked into the Cardinals' locker room with a completely different mindset. If this was the final chapter, live it right. Not to prove anything, not to cling on, but to live honestly with what he had become. The first days were heavy. A disjointed roster, an unstable system, fragile belief, where one mistake could bring everything down. Kurt felt clearly that his body was no longer as strong as before. Old pains reminded him that time wasn't on his side. But unlike the Rams or Giants, in Arizona, Kurt wasn't racing the spotlight anymore. He played with acceptance. Acceptance that he was no longer the center of the universe. Acceptance that every game might be the last. And that very acceptance freed him from the fear that had clung to him his whole life. In the quiet practices, Kurt began doing something he had long forgotten, playing football for the pure love of the game. Not to rewrite the fairy tale, not to silence doubters. He talked to the young teammates like someone who had seen every possible ending. No promises, no sugarcoating. Just talk about responsibility, about showing up and doing your part. The Cardinals didn't have much to lose, and that made them more bearable. In a team with no expectations, Kurt found space to breathe again as a human being. His family followed him to Arizona with cautious hearts. Brenda was too familiar with fragile beginnings. Zachary still needed stability, and every team change meant the whole family had to readjust their rhythm. But this time, something was different. Kurt didn't bring home the obsession to prove himself. He brought a rare calm. Though money, contracts, the future remained uncertain, Kurt no longer tormented himself with the feeling that he wasn't enough. He knew he had done everything he could, and if this road ended in Arizona, he wanted it to end with kindness toward himself and the people he loved. On the field, the Cardinals didn't instantly turn into a winning team. Losses still came, mistakes still happened, but Kurt played with a patience he hadn't allowed himself before. Every throw no longer carried the immediate fear of being replaced. Every game was a possible goodbye, and because of that, he cherished every moment. Kurt knew this might be the last chance not to become great, but to not betray himself. There were nights Kurt sat alone, looking back at the road he had traveled and understanding that his career wasn't a straight line. It was a series of erasures, callbacks, and erasures again. Arizona didn't promise salvation, but it gave Kurt a small stage to speak honestly to his life. He no longer wanted to defeat fate. He just wanted to walk with it without bowing his head. In a weak team, Kurt found a different value in the quarterback role, not as the creator of miracles, but as the one keeping things from falling apart. He talked to young teammates about preparing for the bad days, because those are the ones that truly measure a person. The Cardinals didn't become a headline story, but in that quietness, Kurt Warner was writing another chapter, the chapter of resilience without an audience. Arizona was the last chance for an exhausted man, but not a chance to save his reputation. It was a chance to live true to everything he had learned from failure, responsibility, and love. Kurt took the field every week with a quiet reminder. If this was the final chapter, let it reflect who he really was, not the image the world had once imposed on him. And in the quiet of a team with no expectations, Kurt Warner began to feel something he had never had at the peak. Peace. Not victory, not miracles, but the feeling that he had gone all the way down the road without leaving himself behind. Super Bowl 43 came to Kurt Warner not as a promise fulfilled, but as a very slow, very heavy closing circle. When the Arizona Cardinals stepped onto the biggest stage in American football, the whole world called it a belated miracle, a reward for rare resilience. But for Kurt, that moment carried no sense of redemption. It carried the stillness of a man who had gone too far to still dream of a happy ending. He stood there, under the blazing lights, with crystal-clear awareness that this might be the last time in his life he touched this boundary. The game unfolded like a symphony of opposing emotions. Kurt played with everything left in his worn-out body. The throws were still accurate, the decisions still sharp, and for moments, people saw again the shadow of a quarterback who had once lit up the entire league. But unlike his years with the Rams, Kurt didn't play with the eagerness of someone who believed he would win. He played with the calm of someone who accepted every possibility. Each play was like a possible goodbye, not loud, not dramatic. As the game moved into the final minutes and the balance tipped toward the opponent, the pain didn't crash in like a blow. It spread slowly, deeply, like a fatigue that had been forecasted long ago. Losing in Super Bowl 43 was a bitter historical defeat, but it didn't break Kurt the way previous failures had. He didn't collapse, didn't rage, didn't look for reasons to blame. Amid the cheers of the winners, Kurt felt a strange silence inside himself. In that moment, Kurt understood something he had avoided for years. There would be no final victory for him. Not because he wasn't good enough, not because fate was too cruel, but because his life had never been built to close with a neat, perfect period. Kurt's career had always been broken segments, erasures and rewrites, miracles that came and left without permission. Super Bowl 43 wasn't a chance to fix the story. It was where the story spoke its truth to itself. When he left the field, Kurt looked back at the scoreboard, not with tearing regret, but with quiet acknowledgement. He had done everything he could. No throw held back, no effort hidden for next time. And because of that, this failure carried no resentment. It carried the exhaustion of a man who had fought long enough and real enough. Kurt no longer needed a trophy to confirm his worth. He had moved past that stage long ago, from the moment he took on Brenda and Zachary, from the moment he accepted playing without any guarantee for tomorrow. His family waited for him after the game, not with empty consolations, but with silent presence. Brenda saw in Kurt's eyes not collapse, but closure. Zachary didn't fully grasp the meaning of the Super Bowl, but he understood one very simple thing. His dad had been there, had stood firm, and had come home. For Kurt, that moment was worth more than any title. He had once feared that without winning, he would become a failure. Now he understood that failure only truly happens when people carry resentment. Super Bowl 43 became an emotional climax, not because of tears or public regret, but because of the prolonged silence that followed. Kurt sat alone, thinking about the years stocking shelves in the grocery store, about the Arena League with its empty stands, about the cuts without explanation, about the Rams, the Giants, and finally Arizona. All those pieces didn't lead to a final win, but they led to a man who had learned how to stand straight in defeat. Kurt understood that people would remember this game as a missed opportunity, but for him, it was the moment confirming he no longer had to chase anything. He didn't need to prove he deserved love or remembrance. He had lived true to his hardest choices and had gone all the way down that road. Defeat was no longer an accusation. It was just the outcome of a long journey where victory wasn't always the destination. When the Super Bowl lights went out, Kurt Warner left the field with slow steps, not from pain, but from understanding. He knew that from this moment, his career would no longer be defined by spectacular comebacks. It would be remembered for quiet resilience, for the way one man accepted that some lives aren't granted a final victory, but still deserve respect. Super Bowl 43 closed not as a tragedy, but as a very soft whisper. Some people aren't given a glorious ending by history, but history still needs them to prove that dignity doesn't lie in the final trophy. Kurt left the field with empty hands, but a heart no longer heavy. He had reached a place where resentment had no foothold, where defeat was no longer the enemy. And in that quietness, Kurt Warner understood that he had won in the only way this life allowed him, not by the result, but by the calm when everything had come to its end. After Super Bowl 43, when all the lights had gone out and no promises hung in the air anymore, Kurt Warner stood before the hardest moment of his life with no warning whistle. Retirement. No longer a quarterback. No more playbooks. No more team meetings. No more name called on the field. What disappeared wasn't just a job. It was the title that had been fused to his identity for decades. And when the title left, the emptiness stood naked and terrifying. The first days after that decision passed slowly, heavily. Kurt woke up without a practice schedule, without taped wrists, without a reason to endure the familiar pain. His body gradually stopped reacting like a fighting machine, but his mind felt lost. He realized a cold truth. The world no longer needed him the way it once did. The phone rang less. Questions no longer revolved around schemes or form. People spoke of him in the past tense. For someone who had once existed in the gaze of millions, that silence wasn't just quiet. It was a test of self-worth. Kurt had once thought he was used to not being needed. He had been cut, stocked shelves, lived in leagues no one remembered. But retirement was different from all of that. Before, there had always been an if. If, called back. If given one more chance. Now, there were no hypotheticals left. The door closed not because someone pushed it, but because he chose to shut it. And that choice forced Kurt to face head-on the question he had once avoided. When you're no longer a QB, who are you? Evenings grew longer. Kurt sat alone, thinking about the years gone by and realizing that most of the value he had assigned himself had always been tied to being chosen, trusted, needed on the field. When all those measures vanished, he had to relearn how to look in the mirror without searching for a helmet or jersey. No title left to shield him, only the raw person with the choices that brought him here. It was a confrontation without noise, but deeply erosive. Family became the only anchor. Brenda saw that emptiness and didn't try to fill it with empty encouragement. She understood Kurt needed time to mourn a version of himself. Zachary, with his unchanging need for care, reminded Kurt of another truth. Some values don't disappear when the title leaves. Responsibility, presence, patience, those remained, and still needed him every day. Kurt gradually realized that being needed doesn't only exist on the stadium field. It exists in long therapy sessions, in unglamorous schedules, in staying when no one applauds. When he was no longer a QB, Kurt had to learn to accept that his career no longer gave him the familiar structure to escape big questions. He had once run from the fear of being left behind by training, competing, winning. Now, there was nowhere left to run. He was forced to sit with himself, with old wounds, with fears once pushed back by adrenaline. It was a silent journey, where progress wasn't measured by stats, but by the ability to accept a day passing without needing to prove anything. Kurt realized a painful paradox. While playing, he feared being replaced. In retirement, he feared being forgotten. But right in that fear, he began to understand the nature of self-worth. It can't depend forever on external recognition, because recognition always has an expiration date. Titles can expire. Miracles can leave. What remains is how a person lives when no longer called by name. Retirement didn't bring immediate freedom. It was a slow stripping away, where each day Kurt had to surrender another familiar piece to touch something truer. No longer a QB, he was no longer protected by the role. But precisely because of that, he had a rare chance to redefine himself by values that needed no audience. When Kurt Warner crossed the threshold of retirement, he didn't step into a brilliant new chapter. He stepped into a silence, and in that silence, he learned to live without needing a title to exist. That wasn't victory, nor was it failure. It was late, but necessary maturity. Understanding that self-worth doesn't lie in being needed by the crowd, but in standing firm when no one calls your name anymore. At age 54, Kurt Warner doesn't wake up to practice whistles or packed schedules, but his body still speaks every morning as if it had never been allowed to rest. The aches don't explode into fierce pain, they simmer, linger, familiar enough to become the background of life. Shoulders stiff, back tight, joints reminding him of thousands of past collisions. No climax, no overcoming moment, just the persistent presence of pain, existing alongside everyday rhythm. Kurt doesn't complain, doesn't boast. He has gone too far to expect pity. The worry about health came slowly and persistently. It was no longer the fear of injury right in the middle of a game, but the fear of a man who understood that time has its own way of collecting old debts. Regular doctor's appointments, cautious recommendations, small signs he used to ignore, now had to be listened to. Kurt knew this body had been working beyond its limits for years. What he didn't know was where the real boundary lay, And that very uncertainty taught him to live more carefully, not out of fear, but out of responsibility. That responsibility has no expiration date. Zachary still needed him every hour, every day. The care schedules didn't change with fame or age. They existed steadily, not demanding inspiration, only demanding presence. Kurt understood that there were mornings he couldn't allow himself to be tired because someone else needed him alert. There were nights he couldn't give up because his son's safety depended on his patience. This wasn't dramatic tragedy. It was prolonged tragedy, where endurance was the only choice. Kurt had learned to live with a new rhythm, slower, quieter, but heavier. No more roaring crowds to drown out thoughts. No more titles to soothe the feeling of invisibility. Just small things repeated, and in that repetition he found a kind of meaning without fanfare. He didn't call it sacrifice. He called it the next part of the path he had chosen long ago, from the day he decided to stay when he could have walked away. Sometimes memories came back out of order. A perfect throw, a stadium erupting, then immediately the image of grocery store shelves, empty locker rooms, hospitals, and therapy sessions. All of them coexisted, none overpowering the others. Kurt no longer tried to separate what was peak from what was valley. At this age, he understood that his life wasn't a beautiful curve for others to admire, but a chain of responsibilities linked together. Not complaining didn't mean not tired. Kurt was tired in the quiet way of people who had grown used to carrying loads. He knew there were days without rewards, without confirmation, without milestones marking done. But he also knew that persistent presence was what had kept him standing through every erasure. At age 54, Kurt no longer sought fairness from life. He sought consistency, doing the right thing that needed to be done, even when no one was watching. Family was the center of every decision, not in a romantic sense, but in the most practical one. Time was measured by appointments, necessary rest hours, quiet evenings. Kurt didn't run from the pain, nor did he exaggerate it. He placed it in its proper place, a part of life, not the whole of life. And that very placement helped him keep moving forward without needing climaxes. Age 54 didn't bring release. It brought disciplined acceptance. Kurt Warner lived alongside pain and responsibility like two unchosen companions he had to walk with. No final victory, no late miracle. Just a man continuing to be present, day after day, with the calm of someone who understood that real tragedy doesn't lie in big falls, but in having to keep living decently on days with nothing to celebrate. After all the chapters passed, when stadium lights existed only in memory and the lingering aches still woke with every morning, Kurt Warner stood at age 54, not as a healed man, but as one who had learned to live with cracks that would never close. His life didn't grant him complete redemption. There was no moment when every wound suddenly vanished. There was no ending where every loss was compensated by a final victory. If anything remained, it wasn't glory, but the ability to keep standing when nothing promised anything ahead. Kurt had once been called a miracle, had once been the symbol of the American dream, had once been celebrated as proof that if you never give up, life will open doors. But his own life quietly rejected that simple version. Because if you look closely, Kurt wasn't rewarded with fair happiness. He was given chances, then stripped of them, lifted to the peak, then abandoned, loved, then doubted. Those cycles repeated until he understood that this life doesn't run on fairness logic, but on human endurance. Not being healed didn't mean collapse. Kurt carried the childhood fear of being left behind all the way into adulthood. He carried the years stocking shelves in the grocery store, silent evenings in the arena league, cuts without explanation, injuries that betrayed his body, public failures that shattered belief. None of it disappeared. It was there, deep in the way he walked, in the caution of every decision, in the constant worry that everything could be taken away at any moment. But Kurt didn't let it define his entire being. He didn't deny the pain, nor did he let it become a reason to quit. No miracle wasn't the final tragedy. Miracles had come, had gone, and left behind an important truth. When miracles are gone, the only thing keeping a person standing is character. Kurt no longer clung to surreal moments to prove his worth. He didn't live in nostalgia or bitterness. He lived in the present, where every passing day demanded real presence, not to be seen, but to not disappear from his own life. There was no final victory, and Kurt had accepted that. Super Bowl 43 closed as confirmation that his story wouldn't be favored by history with a neat ending. But that very absence highlighted the core. Kurt no longer needed a trophy to prove he had lived right. He had lived right in the choices no one applauded. Staying when he could leave, carrying responsibility when he had nothing in hand, continuing forward when the world stopped waiting. Family was the irreplaceable remainder, not as a reward, but as a voluntary, lifelong duty. Kurt didn't see it as heroic sacrifice. He saw it as responsibility. Responsibility, with no days off, no expiration date, no audience. In caring for Zachary, in standing beside Brenda, Kurt found a kind of worth the stadium could never give. There, he didn't need to be the winner. He just needed to be the one who stayed. Responsibility became the axis of Kurt's life. Not responsibility to image or fame, but to specific people. It forced him to live slower, more carefully, and more honestly with his limits. Kurt didn't run from physical pain or health worries. He accepted them as the price of a life that had gone too far. Not complaining wasn't because he was stronger than others, but because he understood that complaining didn't lighten the burden for anyone depending on him. Character was what remained after every title fell away. Kurt was no longer a quarterback, no longer an MVP, no longer a miracle, but he was a man who didn't quit in a loud way. He didn't quit by continuing to fight on the field, but by continuing to be present on days without climaxes. He kept his promise to himself that he wouldn't become the one who disappeared when life got hard. Kurt Warner's story isn't an empty pep talk that everything will be okay. It's a harsher reminder. Some lives aren't healed, but can still be lived with dignity. Some people aren't given beautiful endings, but still keep their backs straight. Kurt didn't beat time, didn't beat fate, didn't beat history, but he didn't betray his character. And that's why, when all miracles had been used up, when all victories remained in the past, Kurt Warner still stood there as a complete man in the least glamorous way, not redeemed, not healed, but also not quitting. Only family left to stay for, responsibility left to carry, and a character solid enough not to need anyone's confirmation. In a world obsessed with happy endings, Kurt's story reminds us that sometimes quiet, persistent decency is the rarest form of victory a human can achieve. Looking back at Kurt Warner's entire journey, the lingering feeling isn't the excitement of a fairy tale sports story, but the quiet pain of a man who lived his whole life in a state of insecurity. From a childhood without emotional anchors, years erased by the NFL without explanation, the time-stocking shelves and the Arena League with empty stands, to the Rams' miracle that came too fast and was then turned on by the Rams themselves. All of it showed a bitter truth. Success never erased the fear of being left behind. Even as MVP and Super Bowl champion, Kurt still lived, haunted by the thought that everything could vanish tomorrow, and it did, when he was cut, publicly failed with the Giants, then stepped into Arizona as the last chance of an exhausted man. What makes this story heartbreaking yet honorable isn't the titles, but the moral choices. With no beautiful escape, Kurt chose to stay with Brenda and Zachary when he had no career yet, accepting lifelong responsibility at his most fragile. He accepted defeat in Super Bowl 43 without resentment, accepted retirement when no longer needed, and accepted living at age 54, with aches, health worries, and endless care for his son. That is prolonged tragedy, No climax, no redemption, no miracle, no final victory. The lesson for Americans from this story is clear and real. Human worth cannot be tied only to achievements, titles, or fleeting recognition. A society that worships victory easily forgets those who live decently in defeat. Kurt Warner reminds us that the American dream isn't just climbing to the top. It's the ability to keep character when pushed to the bottom, not being remembered, but not quitting on family and responsibility. In a country always talking about success, this story teaches that enduring dignity is the hardest and most worthy legacy an American can leave behind. If Kurt Warner's journey of not being healed but never quitting touched you, please hit subscribe so we can keep listening together to the real lives behind the spotlight. Thank you for staying until the very end, and see you in the next video where we continue telling stories about people, responsibility, and character, not just about winning.